Today we are analyzing and connecting a strange passage in Genesis in the time of Noah. This passage is just 12 verses long. We're going to take a comprehensive look, and once you start understanding all the deeper connections, then you're going to start to see how this will set up and explain the rest of Genesis and even into Egypt in the book of Exodus. This peculiar passage is about Noah and his son Ham in Genesis 9:18 through 29. This is after the flood, when Noah and his family got off the ark. Chapters 9, 10, and 11 in Genesis are interconnected, so understanding these will start giving a fuller understanding of everything that was going on in Genesis. But before we read this, we need to do a quick overview of Genesis and Exodus, highlighting the points connected in this video.
After the creation of the world, Adam and Eve disobeyed God and let sin enter the world. It got much worse with each generation as there were murders and such horrible behavior that God had regretted making mankind. He decided to kill most of the world with a flood, except for Noah's family. Then after the flood, Noah and his family came off the ark in order to repopulate the earth again. Then mankind came together to make the great city Babel, which becomes Babylon. God didn't like the people making a name for themselves, so he scattered the people and introduced different languages so all the people could not come together to replace him. Then God called Abraham out of Babylon and led him to the land of Canaan. Abraham's descendants becomes God's chosen people. These people, eventually renamed the Israelites, come down to Egypt where they become enslaved, and God promises his people to fulfill his vow to Abraham that the Israelites will inherit the land of Canaan. God sends plagues and breaks the bonds of slavery in Egypt, where he eventually leads them to the Promised Land. That is a quick summary of the events. There was much more going on, but for the purpose of this video, this overview will suffice. We start at the point in the story knowing the flood has happened, wiping out all mankind except for Noah, his 3 sons, and all their wives. These are the 8 surviving members of the human race, and they have to refill the earth. When Noah and his family come off the ark is where God promises Noah and mankind that he will not destroy the earth again with a flood, and he gives the sign of a rainbow that he will honor that covenant. Now we get to the story of Noah and his son Ham. Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine and was drunk, and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done to him. Then he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Now on the surface, this might be one of the weirdest passages in the whole Bible. One of Noah's sons, Ham, walks up on his passed out, drunken, and naked father, sees his father naked, tells his brothers who walk backward to put a cover on him so they wouldn't see their father naked. Then Noah wakes up and curses his grandson. Yikes! The biggest question we have to answer is why would Ham walking in on his father being naked cause such a reaction that Noah would curse his own grandson? Canaan had nothing to do with this scene. The surface of the story makes no sense at all.
In order to understand this, we're going to dig, discover some things along the way, use some deductive reasoning, understand a couple parallel themes from the whole book of Genesis, then confirm our interpretation is correct by connecting everything, even future events. Like I've been saying, you'll only know your interpretation is correct when everything connects perfectly.
So let us highlight a few important things in this passage. Ham saw the nakedness of his father. Ham was the father of Canaan, which is such an important point, it is mentioned twice. The brothers Japheth and Shem walked backward to cover and not see their father's nakedness. Noah woke up and knew what his younger son had done to him. Noah cursed Canaan to be servants of his brethren. And although Japheth is blessed, Shem is blessed, but also mentioned as the only son following God. And finally, this passage ends with Noah's death. The first thing we start with is to figure out the birth order of Noah's sons. You're going to see the importance of this as we move along. Now, the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We know from other examples in the Bible that just because children are listed in an order, that does not mean this is the order of their birth. With only 3 sons, we can write down every possibility. Shem as the oldest, Ham as the oldest, and Japheth as the oldest. That's it. There's just 6 possibilities total. Now let's start figuring this out. We know from Genesis 9:24 that Noah's younger son did something to him. Many people interpret this as referring to Ham, but it doesn't directly name him in the verse, so we're going to come back to this in a minute. We need to go to Genesis 10 and the Table of Nations for a clue. Genesis 10 is a list of Noah's sons and their descendants that settled into the land after the flood. There's an important detail about the birth order of Noah's sons in this chapter. It is right here. And children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. That is a really big clue. Japheth is the older brother of Shem. So if we know this, we can plug in this info and then eliminate 3 of the options that have Shem being older than Japheth. If we take away those 3 options, that leaves us with only these 3 possibilities. One of which has Ham possibly being the oldest, and the other 2 Japheth being the oldest. Now there is only one option that has Ham being the youngest, which matches the description in Genesis 9:24 about Noah waking up and seeing what his younger son had done to him. Then it's solved. Or is it?
I have to throw a wrench in this here. This is when you have to see beyond a passage and understand the larger context of what was going on in the whole book of Genesis. If you study every situation in Genesis, you will find that there's something that is unnamed, but is very real, and that is a firstborn curse.
Let's review every firstborn son in the stories of Genesis. Adam is the first human created by God, so he would be the first created human son. And we know that Adam sinned by taking a bite of the forbidden fruit. Cain is the firstborn of Adam and Eve. He brings horrible sin into the world by murdering his brother Abel. The next story in Genesis is Noah and his sons. The only 2 options that are possible are Japheth or Ham being the firstborn son. So we're going to skip this for now and reconcile it later. Next, we get to the story of Abraham. His first child is by the Egyptian Hagar. This child, named Ishmael, is not chosen to be part of the descendant line and is cast out into the wilderness. Abraham's chosen son Isaac has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the first of the twins out of the womb, but sold his birthright for stew because he was hungry, then got cheated out of his father's blessing by his deceptive brother Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons and a daughter. The firstborn son, Reuben, slept with his father's concubine, which greatly offended his father, and he loses his rights as firstborn. And last, we come to the story of Joseph, who is sold as a slave into Egypt before his family arrives. After Joseph is reunited with his father Jacob in Egypt, he brings both his children Manasseh and Ephraim to Jacob for a blessing. Manasseh is the firstborn son and was supposed to receive the better blessing, but his father Jacob purposely switches his hands and blesses the younger Ephraim as having favor over the firstborn Manasseh. You can see how every story has something bad happening to the firstborn son, to the point of it being inferred as a curse. So this is the larger context of what was going on in Genesis. So let's go back to Noah and his sons. We know that only Japheth or Ham can be Noah's firstborn son. But if Ham is the youngest son, as Genesis 9:24 seemed to indicate, then Japheth would have to be the oldest son, and then the theme of the firstborn curse would not fit, as Japheth was not described in any way of having sinned or fallen short. So there's a conflict here. Either the parallel curse of the firstborn skips just one son in the entire book of Genesis, or Genesis 9:24 is not referring to Ham seeing his father naked. There must be something that we don't quite understand. Again, we have to go deeper. We're going to get back to this in a little bit, but we're going to have to discover something else in order to find a way to connect all the loose threads. Remember, this is one of those situations when you're going to know when you're correct, only when it all connects perfectly. So now we're going to pull on the thread that will start to unravel so many other things. But first, let's reread the central focus here. And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine and was drunk, and he became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside.
Now, it's been historically understood that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Although modern scholarship might have other theories, I like to stick with historical theory unless it's proven wrong. So if Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, then those first 5 books would be useful for interpreting each other.
So with that said, we come to the book of Leviticus. None of you shall approach anyone who is near kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. This is the key. Your father's nakedness is referred to as the nakedness of your father's wife. This whole chapter is about sexual prohibitions. And if the author of Genesis also wrote Leviticus, then this section in Leviticus would be the key to interpreting the passage in Genesis. So if uncovering your father's nakedness means to sleep with your father's wife, then this section in Genesis just took a really dark turn. We know that there were only 8 people that left the ark: Noah, his 3 sons, and all of them had wives, including Noah. If this section in Leviticus is key to understanding what happened with Noah's son, then Ham must have seen his father's nakedness by sleeping with his father's wife, who is his own mother. Ew. That must be shocking for most of us to even think about.
But beyond that shock value, we also need to apply a little logic here. Does anyone think that Noah's wife would have sex with her own son? But if Ham laid with his mother as a power play against his father, then it would probably have been by force. We're talking about rape. Again, this is staggering for most of us to think about this kind of evil. And maybe most won't think we've got this correct. It's too far-fetched to think that Noah's son could rape his own mother. But let's not immediately dismiss the interpretation. Let's follow along with it and see if things connect because of this theory. And further thinking this theory through, now ask yourself, what if that rape resulted in a pregnancy? Wow, we are descending even farther down the rabbit hole of evil. But stay with me. This will start connecting in ways you haven't heard before.
There is precedence for this in Genesis. Remember, we stated that Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, slept with his father's concubine? Okay, that wasn't his mother, but it was a sexual offense towards his father's concubine. And I've also said before that parallel stories are told for a reason. We read this very similar story about Abraham's nephew Lot and his daughters after God destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to come in to us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. So they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. It happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Then they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him. And he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. Doesn't that sound similar to Noah's story? Contextualization is always key. Check out the parallels in these 2 stories. Mass destruction and death just happened with the flood of the earth and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Both fathers, Noah and Lot, were passed out drunk with wine. Lot's daughters have non-consensual sex with their father, then become pregnant with child while their father was passed out. Now, if we plug in the theory of Ham and the rape of his mother in blue, if Ham did rape his mother, he would have had non-consensual sex with his parent, and if that is true, then the rape could have resulted in a pregnancy. Do you see how these stories connect perfectly as contextualized parallels? I believe this story about Lot and his daughters was only told to help reveal what happened to Noah and his son Ham. This is how much credence I place in repeated parallels. But this is going to go way beyond just the parallels and connect so many other things. Now go back and think about what we talked about in the beginning. Ham being the father of Canaan was so important it was mentioned twice. The theory of Ham raping his mother that produced a child would account for that double mention. The writer was drawing your attention to the fact that Ham was the father of Canaan and not anyone else, especially not Noah. And if you understand the relationships at play here, if Noah's wife was the mother of Canaan through rape, then Canaan would not only be Noah's grandson through Ham, but also his son through his wife. And if Canaan was a son of Noah, then the reading of Genesis 9:24 flips around to mean someone entirely different. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. This younger son in verse 24 now would be referring to Canaan, the 4th son of Noah. This verse could mean that he woke up to see the shame he felt towards Canaan's existence. This theory, although troubling, is starting to make sense of things. We know from Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve first sinned, they hid their nakedness from God. They were ashamed at disobeying God in the garden, and only then they realized they were naked. And it's been a theme throughout the Bible that nakedness has been referred to as shame. Now Noah's two other sons, Shem and Japheth, took a garment and covered their father's nakedness, which means they covered his shame. Not only that, they went backward so as not to see their father's shame. Backward, like they went back to when their father's nakedness or shame was not uncovered. If Ham did rape their mother, Japheth and Shem would have disowned their evil brother Ham. Remember when I mentioned Genesis 10 in the Table of Nations? That listed all the descendants of Noah's sons and how they started to repopulate the earth. But let's go back to that verse about Shem and Japheth. And children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. In this entire chapter about the sons of Noah, only the sons Shem and Japheth are referred to as brothers. Ham is not mentioned as their brother. Also, look back through Genesis 9. After Noah woke up, only Canaan, Shem, and Japheth are mentioned, almost like Ham was no longer part of the family, which would reinforce the point that they walked backward to when their father's shame was covered. They had disowned their brother Ham for an evil act. All the details certainly are supporting the theory of rape that produced a child. And only this theory connects everything. If there were four sons of Noah, with the birth order being Ham, Japheth, Shem, and then the fourth son Canaan, this would connect with Ham being the firstborn. This would fulfill the firstborn curse as Ham raped his mother, which would qualify as part of the curse, while none of the other sons of Noah are mentioned as doing anything wrong. Then this order would also fit the description of Japheth being the older brother of Shem in Genesis 10:21. Then lastly, Genesis 9:24 about Noah seeing what his younger son did to him would mean that Canaan, being his youngest son through a rape of his wife, would account for the shame he felt towards his younger son. This theory connects all the loose ends perfectly. And this also answers the biggest question as to why Noah would curse his own grandson Canaan. It only makes sense if Canaan was also his illegitimate son, the product of a heinous rape.
That might sound unfair to Canaan to call him illegitimate, but I only interpret the story in Noah's reaction, not our modern sensibilities of Canaan being an innocent child. If you understand how the Canaanites grew into a sexually immoral people, then that also reinforces how the conception of Canaan and this sin grew into a multitude of sins in his people. Now, this rape theory might still be an outlandish concept. I might still not have convinced everyone yet, until you start seeing how other things in the future connect as well.
We started this video with recapping some of the major points of Genesis, including the story of Abraham. Abraham is led out of Babylon, and God calls him from there. Remember how I said earlier that Genesis 9, 10, and 11 should be read together, because they are interconnected, happening during the same time frame. As we make future videos about Nimrod and the start of Babylon, then you're going to see why. But the fact that Abraham was led out of Babylon, the place of the Tower of Babel, should not be lost on anyone. Abraham followed his father to Haran, and then eventually is led to the land of Canaan, where God starts to make him promises to the land and descendants. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and the Lord said to Abram, "Lift your eyes now, and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever." Then after this, in chapter 15, Abraham does not have a son yet. So God reassures him he's going to have an heir from his body and descendants to inherit the land of Canaan. Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now toward the heaven, and count the stars if you are able to number them." And he said to them, "So shall your descendants be." Then he said to him, "I am the Lord, who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to inherit it." Did you ever wonder why God promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan in particular? As you can see from this map, the three sons of Noah have settled in these areas with the land of Canaan right there in the middle. But if you closely analyze Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, and all the descendants of Noah's sons, then you're going to find that only 4 people's descendants are referred to as settling land: Japheth, Nimrod, Canaan, and Shem. We're going to put it into a table for you. Japheth and Shem make sense as they are both sons of Noah. Nimrod would make sense as he came from Cush, the firstborn of Ham. And we repeat that Ham was disowned so land would skip through him and go through his firstborn to his descendants. And this theory of Ham raping his mother that produced a son also fits perfectly that Canaan would have land of his own, being a son of Noah through his wife. And if Canaan was a product from the rape of Noah's wife, this explains why God would want to lead Abraham from Babylon all the way over to the land of Canaan. God was trying to reclaim land inherited and settled by a heinous crime. The land of Canaan becoming the promised land that God wanted his chosen people to inherit supports and perfectly fits the theory of Ham raping his mother that produced Canaan, who inherited land because he was also Noah's son. So you can see how even future events are explained and connecting because of this theory. Now let's focus further on Abraham and that scene in Genesis 15. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two down the middle, and placed each piece opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they will come out with great possessions. And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Notice how Abraham asked God how he will inherit the land of Canaan? We'll get to the animals in a second. But God talks to Abraham specifically about his descendants serving strangers in a different land that is not theirs. That description of Abraham's descendants is clearly foreshadowing the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt, as they were slaves there in the next book, Exodus. God also tells his descendants will be afflicted for 400 years, while Exodus clearly mentions the Israelites were in Egypt for over 400 years. Also, the nation Egypt will be judged by God, and the Israelites will come out with great possessions, which did in fact happen in Exodus 12 as the Israelites plundered the Egyptians as they left the country. So God told Abraham that in order to inherit the land of Canaan, his chosen people would be enslaved in Egypt, then released and receive more possessions on the way out. Now to the part with the animals. Now that we know that the scene is foreshadowing Egypt, so we can look for more connections. God has Abraham split animals into two down the middle. And we know that when the Israelites left Egypt, they left via the sea, which was split into two. During this time with God, Abraham received a vision of a smoking oven. In Deuteronomy and other parts of the Bible, Egypt has been referred to as an iron furnace, which is just like a smoking oven. In this vision, a burning torch passes between the animals split into two. And when the Israelites are passing between the water split into two, there is a cloud that gives light to the Israelites to show their way. And lastly, the smoking oven also passed between the animals split into two. And remember, the iron furnace or the smoking oven is likened to Egypt, and the Egyptians followed the Israelites into the midst of the sea split into two, but to their own demise.
So clearly God was prophesying to Abraham all the way back in Genesis 15, not only the enslavement of his people, but also the release from Egypt, splitting the Red Sea and heading to inherit the promised land of Canaan. Now ask, why are these two lands connected, Canaan and Egypt? If God was leading Abraham out of Babylon and into the land of Canaan, which is where Abraham already was, why would God need to lead his people into slavery in Egypt just in order to inherit the promised land of Canaan? This is going to come full circle and make sense of everything that God was doing.
Now, Egypt is a very key place in the early Bible, and we need to go back to Noah's sons. One of the lesser known of Ham's sons is named Mizraim, and in Hebrew that name means Egypt. In addition to that, we go to the book of Psalms for something revealing when it starts to refer to Egypt. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob dwelt in the land of Ham. Egypt is referred to as the land of Ham. And this gets even better. Remember that Egypt is referred to as the iron furnace, which is just like a smoking oven? Well, in Hebrew, the name Ham means hot. So Egypt being the land of Ham explains why God was connecting Canaan to Egypt. In Genesis 15, God told Abraham that his descendants would have to go to a land not their own, Egypt, be enslaved there for 400 years in order to inherit the land of Canaan. Now here is how the theory of Ham raping his mother fits. Ham raped Noah's wife, who is his mother. This produced a son named Canaan. Since Noah's wife is mother to Canaan, this makes Canaan a son of Noah. And Canaan would inherit the land of Canaan. Then with Egypt being the land of Ham, God's people would need to go down there for God to judge the nation Egypt, the land of Ham. Do you see how things are connecting? This explains exactly why God in Genesis 15 connected the land of Canaan to the land of Egypt, and why God needed to send his people down to Egypt. But we aren't going to stop here. This gets better and better. And Ham taking another man's wife is the cause for all these actions. In fact, the taking of someone's wife while referencing Egypt was also foreshadowed earlier in the story of Abraham, way back in Genesis 12. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. So it was, when Abram came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh commended his men concerning him, and they sent him away, with his wife and all that he had. So let's compare this Genesis chapter 12 story with Ham and the story of the Israelites. Abraham goes to Egypt because of famine. The Israelites go to Egypt, the land of Ham, because of famine. Abraham's wife is taken to the house of Pharaoh. Ham took another man's wife. The Lord sent Egypt great plagues. God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt in order to release Abraham's wife, in order to release his people. Israel is referred to as God's first wife. Pharaoh released the woman and sent them away after the plagues. Pharaoh released the Israelites and sent them away after the 10 plagues, and sent them away with all they had with more possessions. The Israelites plundered the Egyptians, receiving more possessions. Do you see how these stories are connected? This also reaffirms the weight I place into contextualized parallels, once again showing how the theory of Ham raping his mother is being reinforced by every connection and the parallels too. Now, if you're still not convinced, here's the topper to this parallel. When God sent his people into slavery in Egypt, the land of Ham, the Pharaoh there did not release them at first. In fact, God had to go through 10 plagues in order to get Pharaoh to release his people. Here they are. Now, you might know where this is going, but this is going to show you how God has perfect symmetry in all he does. In only God's magnificent story would he send his people to Egypt, become enslaved, and go through all 10 plagues in order to release his people, culminating in the last plague, the death of the firstborn in Egypt. And that place, Egypt, is called the land of Ham. Wow. Remember how I went through all the evidence to show that the birth order of Noah's sons and how Ham must have been the oldest? This now confirms that Ham was the firstborn of Noah, and there was a firstborn curse associated with it. This explains what God was doing both back at the time of Noah and Abraham, but even the reason he sent his people down to Egypt. And all of this was done in order to release the Israelites from Egypt, the land of Ham, to inherit the promised land of Canaan. Let that sink in, because this now confirms the theory that Ham raped Noah's wife, his own mother, produced a child Canaan, who inherited the land of Canaan because he was Noah's son. Can you see why God linked the land of Canaan to Egypt? All the loose ends are tied, and once again, everything connects perfectly. I'm still not even done yet. I'm going to add even another layer to this. Now we understand what happened to Ham and Noah, why Noah cursed Canaan, and why things happened afterwards. But now we have to understand what was actually going on in that chapter. We start with verse 24. Noah wakes up and knew what his younger son had done to him. We have found out that this means the shame he felt towards Canaan. Then verse 25 is where he curses Canaan, who is not only his grandson through Ham, but also his son through his wife. We're going to confirm this in a second. In verse 26, he blesses Shem, where he mentions Shem and only Shem following God. Then he blesses Japheth in 27. After that, we find out how long Noah lived after the flood, and then it ends with verse 29 and the total number of years until his death. The mention of his death here is key to this whole passage. Again, you have to see beyond this chapter and know all of Genesis well in order to see the larger picture. What was happening here in verses 25 through 27 was this was an end-of-life blessing that Noah was giving to his children, which does confirm that Noah thought of Canaan as his own child. Just like the firstborn curse, which we showed you throughout Genesis, there are things that are not named but evidently real. And an end-of-life blessing from fathers to their sons was a very real thing. The most famous one in Genesis was Isaac in Genesis 27 and the blessing he wanted to give his firstborn son Esau. Then Jacob, with the aid of his mother, comes dressed like Esau and deceptively steals the blessing from Esau. Then Esau comes in from the field and finds out that his brother has stolen the blessing and is distraught. He begs his father for his own blessing and receives the lesser blessing from his father. But if you look at the beginning of this chapter and see what Isaac intended to give, that my soul shall bless you before I die, this was an end-of-life blessing. But there are more. Abraham gave all that he had to his chosen son Isaac and gifts to his sons from Keturah. Then look at the next paragraph. This happened right before his death, an end-of-life blessing. Then later, Jacob gave two sets of blessings. The first one to his grandchildren, where he takes them equal to his own children, which is important because all of these end-of-life blessings were from fathers to their own children. And this is where he blesses the younger Ephraim over the firstborn Manasseh. And here is the key at the end of this chapter. Israel says, I am dying, thus confirming this was an end-of-life blessing. Then in chapter 49, Jacob blesses the rest of his children. He goes through son by son until he has blessed all 12 sons. Now, if you haven't noticed, just because it's called a blessing does not mean a good outcome. Look at this verse. And he blessed them. He blessed each one according to his own blessing. Every one of them got a blessing they deserved, good or bad. Then to finish this chapter off, of course, Jacob dies, confirming this was an end-of-life blessing. So far, we've seen Abraham give all that he had to Isaac and gifts to his other sons. Isaac's blessing, which was stolen by Jacob. Then Jacob gave two sets of blessings, one to his grandsons, which he made equal to his sons, and the other blessings to his 12 children. Notice, all of these were from fathers to sons, and all of them reference death right after the blessing. That's why it's called an end-of-life blessing. Before we get to Noah, if you analyze the whole book of Genesis, you would even say that way back in the Garden of Eden, when God, the father of all three of them, was cursing Satan and disciplining Adam and Eve, that this was the first end-of-life blessing, since they had brought sin and thus death into the world, and God had to guard the way to the tree of life. So now if we plug in the Garden of Eden and how God started the end-of-life blessings in chapter 3, you can see that in every single story in Genesis that you have an end-of-life blessing from a father to their children right before death. So if we understand this, then we can place this verse into the context of the entire book of Genesis and see that Noah was giving an end-of-life blessing to his sons, while noting that Noah's death was mentioned right after these blessings. So now you understand that the curse and blessing from Noah to his sons was an end-of-life blessing that was made throughout Genesis from fathers to their children. And remember earlier how I said the family had probably disowned the evil brother Ham? Take note that Ham is not mentioned during the curse and blessings in verses 25 through 27, even though Canaan is mentioned. So that confirms that Ham was disowned by the entire family due to something really bad happening, like raping Noah's wife, while Canaan is mentioned because he was a son of Noah through his wife.
When you read the Bible, you shouldn't just read a verse or even a chapter and think you can understand what is happening. The only way to understand what is happening in this chapter 9 is to read and study the entire book of Genesis. With this said, since this was an end-of-life blessing, then by definition, it was towards the end of Noah's life. This will not make a difference to understand the exact timing now. But once we get into taking apart Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, and Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, the timing will make the difference as to what was happening in these three chapters and how all these things are interconnected. Since this has been a long video with a lot of information, we need to summarize the breakdown and the conclusions of what happened between Noah and his son Ham.
We saw that the central point in this passage was that Ham saw the nakedness of his father. We identified Leviticus 18:8 in its chapter of sexual sins to show that seeing your father's nakedness was code for sleeping with your father's wife. We saw a parallel story of wine and a drunken father told in Genesis 19:36, with Lot's daughters becoming pregnant by their father. We then took the interpretation of sleeping with your father's wife to see the possible reactions that Noah would have to that, and deduced that a rape that produced a child could have caused his reaction. We went through all the possibilities in the birth order of Noah's sons. We used Genesis 10:21 that said that Japheth was older than Shem and eliminated 3 of the options. That only leaves these 3 options as possibilities. We then showed how Genesis has a parallel theme of the firstborn of every story being cursed throughout Genesis. We then showed how Genesis 9:24 would be in conflict with the firstborn curse, as Ham cannot be the cursed firstborn son and the youngest son to fulfill both of those. Then we plugged in the theory of rape that produced a child to show that Genesis 9:24 would mean an illegitimate son Canaan, while the firstborn curse would be fulfilled by Ham. That solved the earlier conflict and confirmed that Ham was the firstborn son and eliminated the other 2 options. Then the only way for the birth order of Noah's sons to fit would be Ham, Japheth, Shem, and then the youngest being Canaan. We showed how this theory would explain Noah's extreme reaction to curse his grandson instead of Ham. Because shame was correlated with being naked, we showed that Canaan's existence as his illegitimate son would cause Noah's shame. We also showed how Shem and Japheth walking backward to cover and not seeing their father's shame should be interpreted to show that the family went back to when their father's shame was covered. This means that they disowned their evil brother Ham, which fits because in Genesis chapter 10 that the only relationship mentioned between Noah's sons are between the brothers Shem and Japheth. Then we showed that the parallel function of an end-of-life blessing that occurred throughout all the stories of fathers in Genesis, we recognized that verses 25 through 27 was exactly in the form of an end-of-life blessing, because right after that is when Noah died. We showed how Ham was not mentioned during this curse and blessing, reinforcing the theory that Ham was disowned by the entire family because of an evil act. Then we showed how the land of Canaan was central to all the lands of Noah's sons. We showed how Genesis 10 listed the descendants but only mentioned 4 descendant lines that actually settled land: Japheth, Nimrod, Canaan, and also Shem. This fits the theory perfectly that 4 sons of Noah would have rights to settle land. Japheth and Shem were Noah's sons. Nimrod took the land of Babylon and beyond because Ham was disowned, and his son Cush would have inherited the right to his share of the land. And the theory that if Canaan was a son of Noah through his wife, then it fits that he would have inherited the right to settle land of his own. All these details connect and support the theory of rape that produced Canaan, with Ham being disowned. We also showed how the story of Abraham started as he was brought out of Babylon, the land of the Tower of Babel, then led to the land of Canaan, where he was promised that land to his descendants. It makes perfect sense that the land of Canaan would be part of God reclaiming land, which was ill-gotten to such a heinous act as rape that produced the child Canaan, who inherited his own land. Then when Abraham asked God how he will inherit the promised land of Canaan, God starts to describe how his descendants will be servants in a land not their own. We know from Exodus that his descendants, the Israelites, were slaves in Egypt, and God told Abraham that they will serve them for 400 years. And in Exodus, we see that Israelites were there for over 400 years. God also tells them that they will come out with great possessions. And we see after the Israelites are released from slavery, they plundered the Egyptians. And lastly, God tells Abraham that the nation will be judged by him. We find out that Egypt is the land of Ham, and the nation that Ham settled will be judged by God. So now we know why God linked Egypt to the land of Canaan when Abraham asked how he will inherit the promised land. We saw in the early story of Abraham in Genesis 12 how God foreshadowed the Exodus story. Abraham went to Egypt because of famine, just like the Israelites went to Egypt because of famine. We saw that Abraham's wife was taken by Pharaoh, who is leader of Egypt. We have seen that Egypt is the land of Ham, and that Ham also took another man's wife. Then in order to release Abraham's wife, God sent great plagues down on Egypt, just like God sent 10 plagues down on Egypt in the story of Exodus. And later in Abraham, he receives more possessions, and Pharaoh sends him away with those possessions. And once again, just like the Israelites plundered the Egyptians in Exodus. So you can see how God was revealing the story of the Israelites within the story of Abraham in Genesis 12. Then we also see how God revealed the story of the Red Sea crossing back in Genesis 15. God had Abraham cut the animals in two down the middle, just like the sea was divided into two. In Abraham's vision, he saw a smoking oven, while in Deuteronomy, Egypt is referred to as an iron furnace. We also saw in his vision that he saw a burning torch, while during the Red Sea crossing, there was a cloud of light for the people. And lastly, both the oven and the torch passed between the two divided pieces of animals, just like the Israelites using their cloud of light and the Egyptians, the iron furnace, passed through the two divided pieces of the Red Sea. Remember, at the beginning of this section in Genesis 15 was when Abraham asked God how he will inherit the land of Canaan. Just like the Israelites, after passing through the Red Sea, were on their way to inherit Canaan. Now we're going to take the three chapters of Abraham in Genesis 12, 13, and 15 and compare them contextually to the story of the Israelites in Exodus. Pharaoh took another man or Abraham's wife. The Israelites are referred to as God's first wife. God sent great plagues down upon Egypt. During Exodus, God again sent 10 great plagues down upon Egypt. Those plagues were sent in order to release Abraham's wife, just like the plagues were sent to release the Israelites. And in Genesis 12, they leave with more possessions, while the Israelites plundered the Egyptians, receiving more possessions. God then promises the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants, while the Israelites are promised to inherit the land of Canaan. God tells Abraham that his descendants will be enslaved in another country, while the Israelites are indeed enslaved in Egypt. God tells Abraham that they will serve them 400 years, while the Israelites serve in Egypt over 400 years. In a vision, there is a smoking oven and a burning torch. Egypt is referred to as an iron furnace, and during the Exodus, a cloud of light lights the way for Israel. The smoking oven and the burning torch pass between the animals divided in two, while Egypt, the iron furnace, and the cloud of light to the Israelites pass between the sea divided in two. This was God's way of telling Abraham how his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan. And after the Israelites pass through the Red Sea, they go towards the promised land of Canaan. Now we're going to take that same foreshadowing in Abraham and place them in chronological order of the story of the Israelites in Exodus. Then we're going to add in the theory of Ham into this table to see the contextualizations. Pharaoh took another man's wife. Israelites are God's first wife, and Ham took and raped Noah's wife. In the story of Abraham, God promised the land of Canaan to his descendants. He then promised the land of Canaan to the Israelites. And here is how the theory fits. Ham raped Noah's wife that produced Canaan, who inherited land that's called Canaan. God tells Abraham his descendants will be enslaved in another country. While we know the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, we found out that Egypt is called the land of Ham. God sent great plagues down upon Egypt to release Abraham's wife. Well, God also sent plagues down upon Egypt to release the Israelites, his first wife. The plagues in Egypt end with the last and greatest plague, the death of the firstborn curse. We then showed how Ham has to be the firstborn of Noah and how it fits perfectly that the firstborn in Genesis has a curse. There is a smoking oven in a vision to Abraham. In Deuteronomy, Egypt is referred to as an iron furnace, and in Hebrew, Ham means hot. Then only after all of that, Abraham is promised to inherit the land of Canaan, just like the Israelites are promised the land of Canaan, all because Ham raped Noah's wife that produced Canaan, who inherited land because he was Noah's son through his wife. This theory connects and explains everything.
So we can see how we can use connections, deductive reasoning, understanding parallels, then watch how every single thing gets connected perfectly. And only since everything connects perfectly, then we can know that this interpretation of Genesis 9 passage is accurate. It might be controversial and shocking to hear, but I'm 100% sure that Ham raped Noah's wife, his own mother, that produced a child Canaan, who inherited the land of Canaan.
Now, one last thing which will put this interpretation and connection over the top. This will show you that God has a flair and loves an exclamation point. Now, the first three sons of Noah which came off the ark were Ham, Japheth, and Shem. They were supposed to refill the earth. This is where God and Noah establish a covenant. Thus I establish my covenant with you. This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. To show his enforcement of that covenant, God gave the sign of a rainbow in the clouds. Now remember how Abraham was called out of Babylon, then up to Haran, then he made his way to the promised land of Canaan. The route he took is through a stretch of land called the Fertile Crescent. This Fertile Crescent is described as an area of land that has rich soil due to the abundant water sources. We'll show it to you here. It's also described in the shape of an arch. That's why it's called a crescent. This gives me goosebumps and proves that God is telling such an amazing story. If we follow the path of Abraham from southern Babylon up to Haran, through the arch of the Fertile Crescent, and then around and down into the promised land of Canaan, if we trace the path he took, it reveals the shape of a rainbow. Wow! This just proves that God is behind everything. The Bible is the truth, and he just put a finishing touch on a masterpiece.
I just love this perfect symmetrical story that God is telling. These 12 verses in Genesis 9 are part of a section in the Bible which explains what happened for the next 1,000 years. Once you understand what happened, you can understand why God did what he did, from Noah and Abraham all the way to Egypt and beyond. The theory of Ham raping his mother is not something I came up with. It's been a theory which has been out there for some time. But I hope I was able to do a deeper and more comprehensive dive that explained and connected everything that came afterwards. And as you can see from this video, that everything connects perfectly because of this theory. I hope you like this video and analysis of such an odd yet foundational passage. Please like, share, and subscribe, and turn on those notifications so I can continue to connect the Word of God. God bless.